I want to ask you a question based on the things that you just said. The prosecution reaching out versus the defense reaching out. So let's start with, I want to make it clear for viewers. To begin with, you were reached out to by the defense, correct? In
Correct.
the okay, in the state of Idaho versus Coburger. Okay. Now, what you said you did look at was the social media, right?
Well, no, at first they were consulting with us about the cell phone location information, and we just taking upon ourselves, we just ran the social media because actually it was kind of interesting. We were doing internal training in our office, right? So we're like, let's put in Brian Koberger in the social media system, and we'll spit out a report and see what relates to what. When we did, we found the connections between the two, and this was really early on. This was right, I think maybe a week after his name even came up. I think before that.
So now,
And
when you're looking at these things, are they providing you raw data? Is it a forensic download of the device? Are you looking at the actual device? Are you just looking, what are you actually viewing to create what you do?
well, most cases start with a case review. And when I say that, what that means is we get all the paper discovery to start with. And then we know from the paper discovery what they have in evidence, like what digital, we work in the world of digital data, right? So I'm looking for, evidence like cell phones, computers, GPS trackers on vehicles, that kind of stuff, audio recorders. Um, and we look at that. Then we look at what do we actually need to go look at? Because sometimes they clear a device and say there's no evidentiary value. Well, that's for them, but that may be evidentiary value for us because it may build an alibi defense, right? So if law enforcement has two devices in, let's use an example, if they have two devices um, in evidence, one is a Garmin GPS tracker and another one's a cell phone. And their report they wrote says we're estimating the cell phone coverage to be within 4 square miles of the crime scene. Well, I want to look at the GPS tracker, right? Because that thing's probably super accurate and get you precision down to like 1 square meter. But sometimes you'll see law enforcement says, well, we're only charging you with the crime that has to do with this device right here, and totally ignore the rest of the evidence that could build the alibi defense. So we decide and we write a letter that says, this is the discovery you're missing, and here's our next steps. This is what we need to do. We need to go look at this evidence. And sometimes the evidence we have to go to the law enforcement center to analyze. We have portable equipment that goes out in the field. We have a bunch of equipment that goes on planes, and we take it with us. It's cases of computing equipment. And then sometimes they send it to our office. They pack it up. So we get it like, cover the name. We get a box like this in it, and it has, this one has an SD card in it. This is evidence in a case. Sometimes it's, hard drives. Sometimes it's actual like Garmin device or the cell phone itself they'll send to us. But law enforcement typically doesn't let original evidence leave their lab. They send us a copy of it, but we know whether that copy is correct or not. There's forensic tools have authentication methods in them, and you can tell whether something's been altered or changed.
Okay. So when you looked at the cell phone location data for this, did you go to the lab to look at to do like with your portable, or did you get was that
No,
just a paper documentation?
they didn't either. They're using billing records from
Oh,
like your cell carrier. So the same thing, like if you have Verizon Wireless or AT&T and you go out and print your bill and it shows all the phone calls you made, there's a type of billing record called a CDR. It's called call detail record. Now you as a consumer actually have access to this. If you go in right now and log in, there's an area you can go to in there that actually shows your CDR. That is not normally what most people go do because it's buried down in your kind of like customer support portal, and it adds a couple different things to a typical cell phone bill. So a typical cell phone bill, you'll get the person you called, whether the call's outbound or incoming, the two parties that are involved, the two phone numbers, right? And then what it'll give you in these CDRs, which is interesting, is the actual cell antenna that was used. Now, not cell tower. Towers have multiple antennas on them, but the actual antenna that was being used and the azimuth of that. That means which direction it's pointing, but that doesn't mean that's where the radio signal goes. Just means that's the direction the antenna is pointing. So in a typical cell phone tower, let's say, and there's 3, 4, 6, and 8 sector towers, but let's take a three sector tower, you would have three antennas, one pointing, let's say 90 degrees, one pointing like, possibly 270 and 300. So they're not exactly aligned perfectly. It depends on if you're on the edge of a town, you want all the coverage to go one direction. You may have two of them pointing to the west and one pointing to the south, and there's none pointing to the east. So they're not exactly always 360. In most cases, they try to build it 360. So it will tell you those things in a CDR, but it does not tell you the GPS location of the phone. That's often confused with what people call in the industry pings. That is a term that is typically reserved for when you queried the phone remotely and it answered back to the cell network as to the location of the phone. That is like an E911 service. That has to happen live at the time of the incident. So because nobody knows this crime was being committed, then nobody's pinging the phone at that time. What they're seeing is billing records. And
Okay.
what law enforcement does is they take those billing records and they try to estimate cellular coverage from that, but their methodologies are horribly flawed, like beyond flawed. They're so flawed that the IEEE put out a white paper stating that none of what they're doing is supported by any engineering science whatsoever. And I teach at a school along with a couple professors and David Burgess the right way to do this, because the way that is being used in court over the last decade is just nonsense. Like, it doesn't even make sense at all. It's so far from reality. And here I'll do this. So there's okay, let's get into this. There are industry approved ways of doing this. This is what the cell carriers do every day. So back in the day, you used to see all the antennas on the back of the minivan that drove around. It said Verizon Wireless on it, and they tested the network, right? Those days are over. They actually use your cell phone to test their own network. They use it like they're spying on your phone's radio signals. So your phone has what's called MDT, minimization of drive test. No, we drive test, yes, with vehicles and equipment. And I have that equipment here. We go out and actually put the antennas on the vehicle and go drive test, right? That's to test the actual cell phone coverage. Okay. But the cell carrier can also do this without that. They can query your phone as to the location of your phone and the radio signal strength to multiple antennas, but that data is not kept around very long, usually 2 days. Okay. That is because it just monitors and tries to help the health of the network.
Yeah, I can.
There you go. See that thing right there?
Yep.
That's one cell phone tower. That is not 120 degrees. That's not the triangle. If I was to draw the 120 on here, here would be the beginning of it. It would look like this, right? That would be my 120. See the orange area? That is where you can make a phone call. And you're probably like, why can you make a phone call the opposite way of the tower? And I'll explain to you why.
Okay.
So, wait a second. There are, in cell phone towers, antennas do not broadcast in a nice triangle. We all wish they did. That's not the way it works. So you have what's called a main lobe, side lobes, and back lobes. That's what cell phone coverage really looks like. Okay.
Okay.
One antenna, not cell tower. One antenna on top of the tower. There's 3 of them. If you want to know where they're getting the 120 degrees from, see that part right there?
Yes.
That's the main lobe. That is not the total coverage. That is the best coverage area.
Okay.
That means if the victim's house is right here and the perpetrator's house right here, you could very well be sitting on your own couch at home, and at the same time, the cell coverage says you're at the crime scene.
Okay.
Now, the distance on a 4G antenna, theoretically, okay, let's not talk about terrain, environmental factors, height of the antenna, all that, 23 miles.
Okay.
So the antenna covering the crime scene could very well cover Brian Koberger's home.
Own home.
Could be
Yep.
sitting at the couch. Okay?
Okay.
Second of all, the width. Okay? You could be looking at 12 miles. So you're talking about a massive area, right? So, and then you say, well, what about the backside? Here, three backside. There's backside lobes. You could actually be the opposite direction of the cell tower.
Like approaching it or
You could
moving
be
away from it.
You could be anywhere within the backside. So the tower could be facing north. You could be actually south by a mile and still connected to the tower north.
Okay.
So here's what happens.
That makes sense. Okay. That makes sense with what I've been hearing in court too. Got it. Okay.
So here's what happens. You got a cell tower, right? You got the cell tower here. And you got a cell tower here. And you got a cell tower here, right? You could actually be right here heading this direction and be on this tower here. You connected to that tower, right? Hypothetically. And as you move towards here, you don't even connect to this one. It connects you to this one while you're heading that direction.
Interesting.
Because cell phone networks are multi-layered. That means you have cell towers that cover boomer cells that can cover a whole city. You have layered, and then you have to take it by band. Every phone call is made on a specific frequency. You take a cell phone here, right here, this cell phone right here, and you look at the box that it came in, and it says it has 3 frequencies it operates on. Let's use Sprint, for example, 700 megahertz, 2100, 2300, okay? Let me give you a good example. When somebody drives by your house and you hear the bass and it's boom, 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 and your walls are shaking, that's because it's low frequencies. Travels really far, has lots of power, penetrates buildings. High frequencies, the tweeter, the hi-hat, that kind of stuff, do not go through buildings. They don't go very far. So the lower frequency you're on, the further away the tower you could be, the higher the frequency, the closer you have to be. So frequency makes a huge difference in these cases, but what they did is totally ignored that. They just left it off, but they had access to it. They have access to it because it comes on the CDR, and they can match it up against the capabilities of the cell tower, and they would be able to estimate coverage, how far out from the cell phone tower you can be, okay? Then on top of that, you have to use, let me show you here. Sorry, I'm taking screenshots of another case that we were just working on. I'm showing you on screen. So
That's okay.
No big deal. Let's see.
Time. I'm learning so much. And I thought I knew what a cell phone tower did. Like, I'm learning so much.
It's very cute. Okay, here you go. If you could share that, show you.
Mm-hmm.
This is called detail records at the bottom. And you notice how it says band 13 channel frequency. It's operating at 751 megahertz right there. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right here. That's the difference. And this is kind of a network density map showing all the towers and how they're located. And it gives you an idea of the density of cell phone coverage. So you can see if you're in the red section out there, you're probably not going to get a phone call.
Okay.
It's the middle of the Everglades, I think, down there, conservation area. You're not getting the phone call because it's dead. They don't have any radio signal. But anywhere in the orange, yellow, green, and blue, you're going to get a phone call. The blue's the best, and then as it goes out to green, it's a little worse, and then yellow gets okay, and then orange is pretty sketchy coverage, right?
Okay.
So, and that's the way we build these maps out. And basically, the way this works is this. If you don't know what frequency you're operating on, you don't know how far from the antenna you can be. Okay, number one. Number two, cell antennas don't broadcast at 120 degrees. And ZX's little crazy amoeba they put on screen is just complete nonsense and made up. If anything, cell coverage looks more like ectoplasma from Ghostbusters on a wall. It is all over the place. It is scattered. And sometimes there's big, giant, huge section way out in the left. So what happens is if you know the frequency, you know how far you could be. Okay, but theoretically. And then when it comes to Koberger's case, what's interesting is they showed him driving south down the mountain and coming back up, right, around the mountain. That's impossible You know why? Because there's no cell phone towers there in the bottom. None at all. There's zero measurements. They just made it up because they said we have a point here and a point here. And we think based on driving speed, you drove from here to here. That's not necessarily true. According to people, maybe he was hiking and he connected to one tower and connected to the other tower. You're on the edge of the mountain, which explains why you can connect to one and then connect to the other and not even be in a car, right?
Yes.
And that is very problematic for the prosecution because the science that they use is not science, it's junk. It's made up. It's completely made up. These 120-degree pi wedges are not supported in any engineering science. The IEEE says it isn't. Real cell engineers don't do things that way. They use what's called the Longley-Rice model, and they do what's called RF propagation models. Now, you say, how close are those? They've been tested. Universities have tested this. They use this in the field every single day to estimate coverage. All cell carriers do, and they were within 3% of reality. That's how perfect their measurements are. I mean, to give you an idea, in Memphis, Tennessee, there are 299,244 cell towers. I know that because we just worked a case there. That is a lot of cell towers. Their cell towers are in buildings, strapped to the side of a building, big, huge metal structures. There's cell towers all over the place. They aren't just necessarily big physical towers. Okay. Out of those towers, you know how many have a coverage of 120 degrees? 12. Sorry, 12. That's it. So using 120 degrees is an exception, not the rule.
Okay. That makes sense.
So what they've done is they've thrown some data on a nice, pretty map to sell a judge the idea that they could get a search warrant. That's what they do. But the individuals that do this, they don't know the difference. They've been told this, they've been trained this way, they've been taught this way. So let me give you a little peek.
I also heard that on stand from the individual who put the PCA together. So that makes perfect sense. He has already openly admitted that he didn't know what he was doing there and that he did it based upon someone else's instruction. Mm-hmm.
Let me share my screen and I'm going to show you something interesting. So the FBI puts out a book. It's called this CAST Field Resource Guide. This is for their officers, right? And let's see here. Here we go. If you want to publish that, I'll show you. So here's the field resource guide for the FBI. Okay. What's interesting is, let me go through this. This is kind of like their little training book on CAST. And they talk about CAST viz. Okay. They take call detail records, plus the tower list. The tower list is where the physical structure of the tower is located at, longitude, latitude.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And notice this little parameters by all sectors down here at the bottom, this little section right here. They get to choose 60, 90, 120, or 360 degrees and how far out it broadcasts. They just click a button. They don't even know.
Okay, that makes sense.
They just click a button. And here's a historical CDR. And then let's take a look here. Now take a look at this. This is what's interesting. What you're seeing here, right here, is the typical 120 degree, and I don't think I can annotate on here, but this 120 degree pie-shaped wedge over here. Right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
That's what you see in all their maps. But on the left here, if you take a look at that little black dot there to the left of that red arrow, if you drew the 120 degree cone there, you're probably like, why is there green lines to the left, to the backside, outside of this 120 degree cone? Let me tell you why. They drove test that area and they could still make phone calls on that cell tower.
Okay.
Even in the opposite direction of the tower, because they're on the rear lobes. This is the FBI's own training book saying so. And I've also put tons of FBI officers on the witness stand and asked them the same exact thing. And they say, yeah, you can connect to the backside of the tower, and they hem-haw around. Then you have these rules that say, is general rule of thumb, a tower's range can be depicted by 70% of the distance to the next neighboring tower. That is nonsense because they're multi-layered. One tower could be underneath of another tower. And then you have downward tilt on antennas too, which changes the mechanical and manual downward tilt, which changes the coverage pattern on the ground. Also, general rule of thumb, is you'll get daubered in for that. That is not allowed in court. We have to know for sure. We have to give a scientific opinion. There's no such thing as general rule of thumb for court. There's actually law that says you can't use general rule of thumb evidence. Great.
Okay, that makes sense.
And you'll see stuff like, give me a second here. I think you'll find this interesting. It doesn't have to do with this case, but it definitely has to do with another. See this letter from AT&T to the FBI about Nilos saying don't use it. It's not correct. But they still use it in their court cases. This is literally an email as part of their training guide saying do not use this data, but they're still using it in court cases to put people in prison.
Okay. Are we sure that this doesn't apply in the Kohberger case?
They didn't have Nilos records.
Okay.
Nilos are a very specific type of record right up here. And this is what you call ranging data. Ranging data is called OTDOA, observed time domain, time difference of arrival. I'm used to using time domain reflectometry, which is electrical engineering terms, but OTDOA has to do with, I go to the Grand Canyon, I yell, Andrew Garrett, and I hear it go, Andrew Garrett, and it comes back to me as an echo, right? That is the distance it took for my signal, my voice to hit the other side of the Grand Canyon and bounce back.
And bounce back to you. Okay.
Then, you know, when you're a kid, your parents told you, when you hear lightning, count 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, and hit 10, that means it's 10 miles away, right? That's exactly what's going on. They're sending a signal out to the phone, they're bouncing it off the phone, and they're measuring the time difference and saying, based on this, the phone is X amount of distance away.
Okay.
So that's what these it's called ranging data. So you got Nilos, PCMD, RTT. Those are different technologies. TrueCall, different technologies across different mobile carriers. TrueCall is created by a guy named Vladon, who's I know very well, and in its former company called Newfield Wireless, and that's what T-Mobile uses. That was what was being used in the Melly case.
Okay.
So in the Kohberger case, they don't have any of those technologies and it being used. Now, that data that system that tracks this stuff isn't always deployed in every area. It's by case basis. Plus, also, a lot of these, if you're doing like a wiretap order, they'll deploy these technologies on a phone. But you would have to know somebody's potentially going to commit a crime ahead of time, right? In your case of Mr. Kohberger, that is not the case, right? They didn't know ahead of time. So Nilos, PCMD, RTT, I haven't seen any of that data in the case yet. That's what's called ranging data, but that only tells you how far out from the cell phone tower you are, which could be this big arc, right? There's an arc. So cell tower coverage comes out here with some back lobes, and they go, well, you're this far away distance. You could even be that far in the opposite direction. They just pull it out. In Kohberger's case, here's what you can tell. If you want to see where direction, in other words, you want to be able to plot some dots on a map to say somebody went from here to here to here to here because the cell tower could broadcast 5 miles and these are more than 5 miles apart from each other, you can build a pattern in history of where somebody went. Absolutely, without a doubt. That's something. But to say somebody's sitting on the corner of First and Main Street is a whole different story. You can't do that. You get the phone.
That makes sense.
The data in the phone is highly accurate because it has a chipset inside. And I used to be vice president of a company called GPS Core Technologies. We are the ones that developed the software in your phone to allow your phone to talk to the chipset in the phone.
Okay.
So the chipset in the phone receives signals from outer space in the GPS constellation, and that can receive anywhere from 2, 3, 5, or 7 towers, antennas, per se. The more accurate your reading is. But the reason Google Maps knows, which I worked with them back in the day, this is where this is all started. The reason they know you're in the left lane versus the right lane is because that receiver in your phone is highly accurate. So the third-party applications, we call them OTA apps, over-the-top applications. Those applications that sit on top of your phone, Waze, Google, Life 360, hiking applications, those are highly accurate. There's absolutely, if law enforcement gets that data from the phone, there is no arguing that data is not correct. That
Okay.
is absolutely 100% accurate and very accurate as to not only the location of the phone, but even with satellite drift and everything a defense expert could throw at it, you're still going to be able to place somebody in a house industry
Okay.
because
Okay.
there's about 10 sets of data that prove the defendant was somewhere. Um, in most cases, we're lucky to get one, maybe two, right? So we're in the Koberger case, my understanding so far is they have some pictures with pictures with some GPS data embedded inside of it. And then, but you have to be careful on that. Somebody could text you a picture that has a GPS location inside that does, and you save it to your pictures, but it doesn't mean you were there.
Okay.
So and then they have call detail records, which is the billing records from the network carrier. That's
Okay. Okay. That makes sense.
it.
Now,
When you talk
if
about like how do you vet something, like when it comes to experts, unfortunately I'm in the world of kind of like the wild wild west, right? We don't have a non-vendor, in other words, a vendor neutral association per se. You have law enforcement associations, and you have one that recently converted into a little bit of non-law enforcement because they're running out of money. But typically, what you have is you have experts that get certified in the use of a product, but the real test of your skills is in court. The judge allows both parties to put their experts forward. They both sometimes don't agree to certain things. Most of the time, 85% of what they say they agree to. Both the prosecution and the defense experts say yes to many questions, and they're pretty much the same. Then about 15% they say, no, you're wrong, right? And that's when the battle comes in. And the judge is the gatekeeper. They get to decide whether you're an expert or not. So there
right,
are processes used to determine whether somebody's an expert, and that is through what's called Dauber or Fry hearings. It's where you get to test the expert and say, are they actually an expert? So, and you see a lot of that in our industry, and there's a reason why. Um, if the prosecution's expert is really bad, right, and they have just a little bit of training, we want them on the witness stand. Why wouldn't we tender them as your expert? Please put them up there. So we'll crucify them, right? Well, absolutely. So a lot of times people get vetted as experts just because nobody wants to challenge them. It's just to get them on the witness stand to challenge them on the witness stand. Because if you get them thrown out, they may get replaced with somebody that's better, right? So you want the bad person on the witness stand. That's kind of trial
right,
strategy, right? It's just
right.
trial strategy stuff. There's two parts to this. One that we worked on. One was the social media stuff, and the other is the cell phone evidence. And the defense cell phone expert is not correct. He's actually incorrect in a lot of areas. And I know this. The FBI's training school called Cellular Analysis Survey Team, their instructors are my business partners in another business. We know very well what's truth and what's not. And what you have is you have an industry of experts, so-called claimed experts that are not engineers. They have no experience. They've read this stuff out of a book. They've never went out in the field and actually taken radio frequency measurements or tested cell phone towers, and they're up there in court testifying. And
Mhm.
the individual they hired, unbeknownst to them probably, the software that he created has been daubered and others thrown out of court
Get it
numerous
now.
times. It was a
Programming.
financial decision, and then it wasn't like whether we thought he had a good case or not, but clearly when we saw the report about the cell phone evidence, we all kind of chuckled and go, "That's not right. None of that's right. It just doesn't make sense."